Okay. Okay. We are recording. Okay, Cece, you're on.
Yes, I know. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cece Sloan, and I welcome you to the Shakespeare and Modern Culture Society of Laguna Woods and the Continuum of Shakespeare in a Divided America by a leading scholar of Shakespeare, James Shapiro. Perhaps James is even more Shakespeare than William, and he tells us what Shakespeare's plays tell us about our past and our future. We opened our series in December with an appetizer of the Shakespeare-like musical story Hamilton, which opened in 2015, presented beautifully by Julia Lupton of UCI. Then we moved on with the astounding help of our own Gloria Moldau to the first of the book's chapters, the struggle that John Quincy Adams had with his love-hate relationship with Shakespeare's Othello in the early 19th century. And now today, the amazing Gila Zalan treats us to who got to perform in Shakespeare's plays in the 1840s, America. Not African Americans until Paul Robeson as Othello on Broadway 100 years later. But surprisingly, women, in particular Charlotte Cushman, the do-all and be-all actress of that day. So sit back, enjoy yourselves quietly, please. You may even stop your own videos, leaving your computer window with just Gila and the exciting images that she shares the screen with. Following her presentation, we'll come back to hear your comments. So quietly, please turn off your video by hitting stop video. It's either on the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen where you can command many things, but stop video is what you want. Thank you ever so much. And Gila Zalan, please take over.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen with you. And
Can't hear you.
I can't hear you either.
you can't?
Now we just did. We just did for the first time when you said you can't.
Oh, wait, hold on. That's bad. Let me see if this works better. Let's go back to here.
I'm
Can you
Gila
hear me
Zalan,
now?
and I'm talking about
Can you hear
Charlotte
me now?
Cushman and
Yes.
in early America. So here we are in the early part of the 19th century in America, a very young country, recently out of the clutches of an empirical monarchy and fighting for individual freedom, where slavery colored the personal prejudices of most people, including those who wished to abolish it, where theater was one of the few forms of entertainment and Shakespeare was the looming giant. We had also recently become independent of religious zealots that wanted to ban all theatrical productions, which, as far as they were concerned, were as bad as gambling or boozing, both of which, along with theater, quickly became American pastimes. To top it off, theater was also banned by politicians during the long years of the Revolutionary War, probably because the only popular playwrights were British, especially William Shakespeare. And as popular as Shakespeare was, as Gloria pointed out, so tellingly last month, certain of Shakespeare's plays were anathema to some Americans, in particular Othello, because mostly of its prominent theme of intermarriage. Envy and jealousy may have been the main themes of this play, but the villain's underlying envy of a Black man's high position was the catalyst. And the weakness of the Black man's character, which allowed him to succumb so heavily to jealousy that he would stoop to murder, may have seemed to many in 1600s England, as it did to our 1800s America, a deplorable but believable act. They say that Shakespeare never left England, that his themes were either based on stories already written and published, or ones that he had heard from actual travelers. What he knew about a Black man's fall from grace was, I would guess, only in his imagination. I also mention here that he may never have met a Jew, but his picture of Shylock probably conformed to the general opinions of the day of Jews as moneylenders. His plays could certainly have played on the prejudices of the masses. In America, where the powers that be were not about to abolish slavery, mostly because it was not economically expedient, but also because most Americans, even those who did wish to abolish slavery, were unable to accept the Black race as equals. And aren't we still fighting that antiquated instinct? Against this background was born a woman who became the most famous actress of her time, both in America and abroad. Though she may have faded from all of our minds, vanquished by other famous names of that century, Sarah Siddons, Fanny Kemble, Sarah Bernhardt, Charlotte Cushman was definitely the unquestioned great actress of her day. And my story is about Charlotte and theater in early America. Until Charlotte came on the scene, the best known actors were British, specifically the Kembles, and in that family was Sarah Siddons and her niece, Fanny Kemble. And in 1832, when Charlotte was 16 years old, they all came to America and brought with them productions of a variety of Shakespeare's plays, including Othello, which, despite its depraved theme in the eyes of many Americans of interracial marriage, was watched avidly. Let me add here that 2 years after her American tour, Fanny Kemble, the youngest of the Kemble family, married an American plantation owner, Pierce Butler. Do you think he was related to Rhett Butler of Gone with the Wind? No. In any case, Fanny was not happy with how her husband treated her, forcing her to give up her career and run his household. But even more than that, she was appalled at the way American men, among them her husband, treated their slaves. They complained about the intermarriage in Othello, but were busy making mixed-race babies out of wedlock. This, to Fanny, was ludicrous. Slavery was abolished in England in the early 1800s, and the Brits were getting used to Negroes as early equal members of society. America is still having problems in that area. So the marriage lasted maybe 5 years, after which Fanny went back to England with her 2 little daughters and resumed her acting career. So back to Charlotte Cushman. She was born in Boston in 1816. When she was 13, her father died, and she suddenly had to support herself and her younger siblings because she had a very unusual contralto singing voice. Friends gave her music lessons, and at the age of 14, she appeared in a concert in a Boston concert hall, singing 3 solos. That was in the year 1830. By this time, theaters had arisen in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere, and theatrical presentations were the rage. From highly regarded dramatic presentations, including a great deal of Shakespeare, to variety shows, which might consist of a short Shakespearean scene, a circus act, a musical piece, definitely the forerunner of vaudeville. Gloria mentioned last time that the language in Shakespeare was closer to what the American people spoke at that time than it is now, but let me add a few thoughts here. Part of what appealed to Americans was that several of Shakespeare's plays were about kings who came to power in a criminal manner. Richard III, Hamlet, or kings who had gone crazy. King Lear, which was proof that the monarchy they fought to rid themselves of was truly corrupt. And since many of Shakespeare's characters came from all walks of life, Americans could identify with them, despite the fact that Shakespeare wrote 200 years before. Also at that time, people became interested in Shakespeare's own life. They described him incorrectly as a man with almost no formal education who became the most important writer in the English language. To Americans, this meant that he was a self-made man who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps and become successful through his own hard work and determination. An American credo to this day. Now, back to Charlotte. I'll start by saying that I have every right to call my subject Charlotte rather than the more formal Miss Cushman, since she was so famous and beloved that newspapers called her by just her first name. She was our Charlotte. So after a few young years of singing solos in concerts, she made her professional debut singing the part of the Countess in The Marriage of Figaro at the Tremont Theater in Boston. And she did so well that the Cavernous St. Charles Theater in New Orleans engaged her as First Lady. That's the actress who was automatically chosen to play the lead. Convinced that she needed to hit the rafters in every part she sang, she overused her voice and soon developed vocal problems that ended her singing career. So, her vocal cord problem having left her with an uncommonly deep voice, the manager at a prominent New Orleans theater suggested she take up acting. He introduced her to the leading man of a repertory company who asked her to do the part of Lady Macbeth in a benefit performance he was arranging. Now, think of this. She'd never studied acting. She probably had never acted in a non-singing role, at least that I could find. And he goes and puts her in the female lead of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Wow. And she was only 19 years old. Now, I figure this might not have been unusual in those days. And in her own words, she was so enraptured with the idea of acting this part and so fearful of anything preventing me that I did not tell the manager I had no dresses until it was too late for me to be prevented from acting it. And the day before the performance, after rehearsal, I told him. Appearing in a play in those days might have meant being thrown into a part you were probably ill-prepared to fill, and you had to supply your own costumes in the bargain. But Charlotte was saved by the bell. Too late to find someone else for the role, she was sent to the French Theater, also in New Orleans, where the female star willingly gave her a dress. Somehow it all worked out to the satisfaction of the manager, the audience, and all the members of the company, and Charlotte's life course was settled. Her next adventure brought her to New York, which was beginning to present itself as the theatrical center of the country. Remember, This was in the late 1830s. Theater itself had been resurrected in the country not many years before, and now there were theaters in every major city, probably each of them presenting their own version of a Shakespeare play. Her first stop was at the esteemed Park Theater. It was one of the oldest theaters in New York, near City Hall on Park Row, and continued to exist even after it moved uptown in later years. Anyway, the manager there said he'd be willing to give her a trial, which after her success in New Orleans did not sit well with her. The young actress had tasted success and wasn't willing to now take a lowly position. But before the decision was made one way or the other, she was approached by Thomas Hamblin, the manager of the Bowery Theater. Situated on the Bowery in New York's Lower East Side, it was a poor cousin but eager competitor of the Park, and under Mr. Hamlin's management, it was growing in reputation. In any case, Hamblin, who had heard such good things about Charlotte from the New Orleans theater, asked her to audition for him, which, of course, she did, leading to an offer of a 3-year engagement at $25 a week for the first year, with an increase of $10 a week each year after. In today's money, that would be equivalent to about $500 a week. Suffice it to say, she accepted immediately. She was not quite 20 years old. She had performed in only one dramatic play before this, although opera has to count as experience, and she was now about to earn $500 a week. My first job in theater paid me the equity minimum of $95 a week. Of course, I was only in the chorus. Back to Charlotte. Admitting that she had no wardrobe, Mr. Hamlin took her under his wing. He helped her acquire a wardrobe, and for a $5 a week retainer, he began to manage her career. With things going so well for her, Charlotte sent for her mother and her younger siblings to live with her in New York. Of course, you can't expect everything to continue running so smoothly in the life of a dramatic heroine. 1 week before she was to open at the Bowery, she became seriously ill and was unable to appear for 3 weeks. In the 4th week, this was her schedule. The first night, September 12th, 1836, she repeated her role as Lady Macbeth. The next day and every day thereafter for a week, she played 2 or 3 roles a night, typical of theatrical entertainment. Theaters presented multiple plays or acts of plays in a single evening. At this point, I have to quote her biographer, Claire Erskine Clement, who describes the theater scene at that time. It is difficult to conceive how any actress can go through the amount of labor which Charlotte Cushman performed during her first 3 years in New York. In those days, long runs were unknown. The public must have novelty. This was supplied by a change of bill each night, while it was not at all unusual to give 2 or 3 plays in an evening. I don't know how this would affect an ordinary actress, and my guess is most actresses had to abide by similar routines in those days, both for the audiences and the pockets of the managers. But for Charlotte, it was a little too much, and she once more ended up in bed. And worse, while convalescing, the theater had a disastrous fire, and all of her costumes were burned. And of course, she could not complete her contract with the Bowery since there was no theater to complete it in. Picking herself up, she turned her attention elsewhere and was able to obtain a 5-week engagement in Albany. She was so successful, both on stage and off, that her 5-week contract turned into 5 months. And once more, she acted in a variety of different roles, receiving good reviews both as an actress and a personality. She was invited to parties and attracted much attention. But again, all of her success and feelings of accomplishment were marred, this time by the death of her brother, who was thrown from a horse that she had given him as a present. The guilt and the grief that followed must have been indescribable. In her words, I lost him by a cruel accident, and again the world seemed to liquefy beneath my feet, and the waters went over my soul. It became necessary that I should suffer bodily to cure my heartbleed. I placed myself professionally where I found and knew all the mortifications in my profession, thus conquering my art. I would conquer my grief and myself. And what she did was decide to learn her trade as an artist, to study it thoroughly, to learn by doing. Thus humbled, her pride no longer standing in her way, she went back to the Park Theater in New York and accepted a 3-year engagement as what they called a walking lady. In other words, she was everybody's understudy, was cast in any and every part nobody else was doing, and probably did a few other backstage jobs as well. And since her contract was not to begin until the fall season, Charlotte spent the summer of 1937 in theaters around the East Coast, New York, Boston, Buffalo, and others. A Boston write-up was as follows. She appeared as Lady Macbeth and astonished everyone. During that brief season, she also had the opportunity to perform her first male role, that of Henry in Speed the Plow. At that time, it was not unusual for women to play men's parts. The first actress to do so was Sarah Siddons in the early 1800s. In fact, she played Hamlet many times as well as other roles. She did not, however, wear men's pants, as Charlotte and other actresses did after her. In Charlotte's case, she wore the same costume a man would wear and was fully accepted as a man right from the get-go. But what was most interesting about her performances was that she was equally accepted as a woman. Lady Macbeth, of course, as pointed out, but also Viola. Viola is the central character in Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night. She's washed up on a beach and disguises herself as a boy and finds employment with Duke Orsino, the wealthy young ruler of Illyria. Here, she had the opportunity to play a boy and a girl, and from what I've read, excelled in both. Charlotte returned to New York to fulfill her 3-year contract at the Park Theater, and then, somewhere toward the end of her 3rd-year run, her Cinderella story began, the kind of story that makes for plays like 42nd Street or movies like A Star is Born. It seems that just before a performance of a play called Guy Mannering, the actress who played the minor role of Meg Merrilies took ill, and Charlotte stepped in. The part wasn't one that people generally cared about one way or the other, and so nothing was expected out of the ordinary from anyone who played the part. And Charlotte herself didn't expect anything unusual, since, as she had seen it played by the actress who was now ill, it didn't look like much of a part. But as she waited in the wings and watched for her entrance, she heard the characters on stage speak about her character as if she was no longer in her right mind. And that clued her in to how she would present this performance. At her cue, she came bounding in a startling, weird, and terrible manner, which took the leading man, Mr. Graham, by surprise, and probably the audience as well. In fact, Graham headed right for Charlotte's dressing room right after the show, and this is how she describes it. I hadn't thought that I had done anything remarkable, and when the knock came at my dressing room door and I heard Graham's voice, my first thought was, oh, now what have I done? He's surely displeased with me about something. Imagine my gratification when Mr. Graham said, Miss Cushman, I have come to thank you for the most veritable sensation I have experienced for a long time. I give you my word, when I turned and saw you in that first scene, I felt a cold chill run all over me. Where have you learned to do anything like that? Well, her reviews and the audience's appreciation equaled that of Mr. Graham, and she was an overnight success. After 4 years of hard work as a novice actress, and with that role, she found her voice. She brought to each part she did after that a physical energy and emotional intensity that was not usual for the stage at that time. Actors were expected to just stand on stage and declaim, but Charlotte changed the art of acting and soon became one of the most admired and acclaimed actresses of her time. By the time she left the Park Theater, she had acted in over 30 different plays. In 1/3 of the roles, she played the part of a man. As I mentioned earlier, women playing breeches roles or pants roles was not uncommon in those days. The difference is in how she portrayed the men. Most female actresses were immediately recognizable as pretty young women. Some say that wearing tights or pants titillated the men in the audience, but in Charlotte's case, she was immediately accepted as being a man in each of her male roles. When warranted, she was strong and aggressive, and when called for as in the part of Romeo, she could be sweet and loving. Although Romeo also had to be athletic in his sword fights, and she was. So, speaking of Romeo, Charlotte is famous for having played Romeo opposite her sister Susan's Juliet. As I mentioned earlier, Charlotte was the family breadwinner. In the 3rd year of her contract with the Park Theater, her younger sister was left in the lurch by a ne'er-do-well husband. And this is a story worth telling because the sisters had no father. Their grandfather forced 14-year-old Susan to marry a 60-something friend of his. This is no lie. In fact, from what I've read, women were still pretty much at the whim of men, even in our brave new world. But when a year into their marriage, Susan bore him a child, the old geezer up and disappeared, leaving Susan to her fate. Women in those days were just not worth much. And since many of Shakespeare's women, even those that came from lowly breeding, showed strength and individuality, women made up a good percentage of the audience. In Susan's case, her sister Charlotte came to the rescue and convinced her to take up acting. Since most actors weren't expected to do much more than learn lines and wear costumes and makeup, Charlotte coached her sister to play the part of Juliet to her Romeo at the Park Theater. They brought the house down and her sister's career was begun. She was brought on board and given a number of small parts to do. Sometimes during that season, Charlotte approached the theater manager and requested that her sister get paid $10 a week and that her own salary be raised. The manager said no, and the sisters were immediately accepted at a theater in Philadelphia. It wasn't long before the Park Theater saw the error of its ways, and she and her sister were asked back to the theater on their terms. From then on, Charlotte managed her own career, in fact, her own life. This, of course, raised the ire of some respectable people who couldn't accept that a woman was so independent. But she had too many fans for these feelings to affect her. She soon became the reigning queen of Shakespeare in America. In 1844, at the age of 28, she played Lady Macbeth opposite W.C. Macready, a well-known British actor. He was so impressed with her performance, he suggested she come to England where your talents will be appreciated at their true value. And in December of 1845, she appeared at the Haymarket Theatre in London as Romeo opposite her sisters Juliet. Until that time, Romeo and Juliet had all but disappeared in the Shakespearean repertoire. Most of the men that had played Romeo in earlier years weren't afraid to show off their feminine side. There are references in the play to how Romeo appears effeminate in his love scenes with Juliet. He's accused of being effeminate by Friar Lawrence, who chastises him. Art thou a man? Thy form cries out thou art. Thy tears are womanish. Unseemly woman in a seeming man? Well, that was enough for the actors arising in the early 19th century. No Romeo for them. And those guys that did play him were often much too old for the part. I mean, Romeo was supposed to be in his teens. So the play dwindled away until Charlotte came on the scene. So she was an immediate success, praised to the hilt in the London Times. Quote, "It's enough to say the Romeo of Miss Cushman is far superior to any Romeo that has been seen for years. Miss Cushman's Romeo is a creative, a living, breathing, animated, ardent human being." Pretty much at the same time, a young man named Ulysses S. Grant was a newbie in the U.S. Army. The soldiers were encamped near the Mexico border waiting to see if they would be engaged in battle. They were so bored, the guys at the top were a little worried about them. And since there was no USO to entertain them, they decided to entertain themselves. They built a makeshift theater and started acting plays they chose to present. Naturally, Othello was near the top of the list. About unsatisfied and unhappy military men, it would seem to fit the bill. But who could play Desdemona? Most army men were, well, pretty manly or wanted to be thought as such. However, U.S. Grant was relatively small and had a pretty face. So much to his chagrin, he was chosen to play the blonde Desdemona. They say he looked very good in a dress. However, this being the army, most of the men, including both Grant and the one chosen to play Othello, felt it would impugn their manhood. And after much discussion, Grant did not, after all, play the part. Instead, they hired a professional actress, Gertrude Hart, to play it. And soon they built a real theater and invited professionals to entertain them. Not long after this incident, Grant grew the beard by which he is recognized to this day, ostensibly to hide his delicate features or to enhance his manhood, whichever. A cartoonist of the time ridiculed the prospect of men playing women's roles. I guess beards were a strong show of masculinity. Nowadays, I think beards are a strong show of not wanting to shave anymore. It seems quite a discussion about men playing women's roles, though nobody protested women playing men's roles. And a point is made in James Shapiro's book that white men felt a strong need to profess their superiority over women and over non-white men. Has it changed much? Not in a lot of this country. From then on, Charlotte Cushman made her name in both America and abroad as the most celebrated actress in the English-speaking world, having been seen on stage by millions. They had parades celebrating her, so her importance as a cultural icon was really unprecedented. There is no time here for Charlotte's personal life. People accepted that her career would have been hindered by being someone's wife, and she was aware, as were others who knew her, that being a wife could not be her choice in any case. From the time she started playing Bridget's parts, it was kind of taken for granted, so that at the age of 26, when she met Rosalie Sully and began a short-lived love affair, it didn't seem to raise very many eyebrows. Rosalie's brother was a rather well-known artist who seemed to enjoy painting women, notably his sister and other lesbians. No, not in America, where religious groups had a strong feeling. No, being gay was not in any way accepted. It was not. But actresses were a different breed. Nor would she have cared if it did raise eyebrows. She was young, extremely talented, already quite famous, and a favorite of theatergoers. She had the freedom to choose her lifestyle when few other people really had that choice. In fact, it's only recently that same-sex couples were legally accepted in this country. Almost. She had a number of affairs, and of importance was a journalist named Matilda Hayes, with whom she had a very close 10-year relationship. In Europe, they were publicly accepted as a couple. Well, at first, until Victorian culture took hold. And 40 years later, Oscar Wilde and others were actually imprisoned for sodomy. What a world. Eventually, Charlotte took up with a sculptor named Emma Stebbins. Throughout her career, Charlotte met and was very close to a number of notable people, both in the political and cultural world, both in America and in Europe. She performed before queens and kings, and in America was seen as Lady Macbeth by President Lincoln, who claimed it was his favorite Shakespearean play. He should have stopped going to the theater after that. Sorry, I digress. But it is ironic that Charlotte's final New York performance was at the Booth Theater in New York, where she played Lady Macbeth. And her farewell performance overall was in Boston at the Globe in 1875. She was 59 years old. She retired shortly after to a villa in Newport, where she succumbed to cancer 10 years later. She was tended by Emma Stebbins, who remained with her despite her dalliances to the very end. Elisa Merrill, a professor in the Department of Performance Studies at Hofstra University, said of her, "I'm convinced she was the most celebrated woman in the English-speaking world because she had been seen by millions of audience members in both the US and in Britain during all of her years on stage, and she was an icon for Americans. They had parades celebrating her. So her importance as a cultural figure was unprecedented, as I have said." The New York Tribune's obituary notice reads, "The future will speak of Charlotte Cushman with pride and gladness. The present can only tell her story in the quiet accents of grief." And yes, there were some male actors as well, gracing the American stage in early America, and I don't mean Ulysses S. Grant. Most of them were British, like Edmund Kean, who died in 1833 at the height of Charlotte's fame. But Edwin Booth, on the other hand, was an American actor who lived until the 1860s and was considered the greatest American Shakespearean actor. Unfortunately, his fame was marred by his brother, John Wilkes Booth. Oh, we won't talk about that right now. And then there was the American actor Ira Aldrich, who was born in New York, but being a Negro would have been relegated to acting with an all-Negro cast in America, if at all, that is. So he emigrated to England, where he claimed to be a descendant of an African prince, and began his career there at a small theater playing, of course, Othello. Though he started by playing characters that could be considered swarthy or dark-skinned, he eventually graduated to parts like Richard III and Macbeth. So here was an American actor who had to leave America to gain fame. Not unusual, I suspect, especially for Negroes. So, theater in America, kudos to the women, but let's hear it for the men as well.
Okay. That was that.
Gila, that was amazing. I so enjoyed that. The history of theater, particularly by a woman in America and in the world, of course, as well, or how she got to the rest of the world. I just want to thank you so much. And I have a feeling you enjoyed preparing this.
I did. I had fun. I did make a movie of the whole thing, as you could see, even though I'm wearing the same outfit now. I did then, but I didn't want to take any chances of losing my voice or some, or the not the visuals not coming out. So
Well, actually, in my thank you notes, I wrote, thank you for being here and thank you for being on video.
got it.
So I wonder whether you could stay a little longer and we open up our audiences. Folks, I hope you can start your videos, and if you have any questions or chats for Gila, I'm sure she would love to hear them. Did you raise your hand, Roxanne?
I didn't, but I just want to say thank you. That was great. I enjoyed it. I loved hearing about Charlotte and all the others and stuff I didn't even know. And I'm an acting teacher, so thank you so much, Gila.
Have you done Shakespeare?
Yes, I did. When I was at the Academy, I played Lady Macbeth.
Of
That
course.
was over 40 years ago, and she is one of my favorites. She's so evil. I love her.
She is needless. Any other questions or comments about what I have to call a great performance by Gila? Yes, Sue.
Yes,
You-
I had to unmute. Yeah. It was just so interesting to learn about something that I knew so little about. I didn't know it existed. And just opens up a whole new area of knowledge and just awareness. And it was a very good and very interesting presentation.
Thank you. I have to say that when I started working on it, I felt the same way. And as I was doing more and more research, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I did not put into this. There just wasn't the time, but it was a fascinating learning experience.
Well, here again is where we have to thank James Shapiro, the foremost scholar on Shakespeare's life and the plays, and his new book, of course, well, not so new anymore, from which I gathered enough information to create this series of which you will hear and see more to come. But again, what he promises that we will learn about our past here in America because of Shakespeare's participation, or the participation of so many with Shakespeare's plays in schools, in theaters, and mostly read by everybody at the turn of the 20th century. That was the most popular reading, was the Bible. As Gloria said in her talk last month, the Bible and William Shakespeare were on everybody's was in everybody's bookshelves. So we're going to continue that. So our next meeting is February 10th, and the following one is exactly the same day, but in March 10th. The calendar follows the February and March follow each other in same order. And but in February we're going to show a film, and it's one of the plays that Gila just mentioned, done by men, which is Looking for Richard. And this is Al Pacino, who starred as Richard III way back in the 60s in Greenwich Village, the Bleecker Street Playhouse. And he's looking for Richard. He's looking for the Richard that he wants to portray on screen. So I think everybody will enjoy that. And hopefully it will be in our meeting hall, which is at the 19 restaurant. And I will be sending notices out for that. Hopefully we can do it there February 10th. And in March, we will continue with James Shapiro's look at our past and our futures, as he calls it, with more information on Lincoln and how he played into Shakespeare. Shakespeare was his favorite reading material of Abraham Lincoln was William Shakespeare. Any more questions before I thank you all again?
Great job, Mom. Great job, Mom. I love you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. How great to see you. Sorry. Sorry you can't come to the next meeting.
Oh, well, another time.
Rebecca is also a wonderful actress.
Well, we have some very nice chats for you, Gila. You can pick it up on your own screen. And someone wrote, she found her own Richard. One of our friends here, Carol, said, I found my Richard. I'll be married 50 years in May. Well, Carol, applause to you. I love it. Okay, everybody. So we're all getting better at our muting and our stopping our videos. So Zoom may become we can become more patient with ourselves on Zoom. But again, I want to thank everybody for coming on here. And Becky, thank you for your little prompt earlier. That was good.
You bet. I do this all the time.
Okay, good. And so long, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye, Gila. Thanks so much again.
Yeah, thank you. Bye all. Thanks for coming.
Bye.